Well, Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa has reassured world leaders at the UN General Assembly that his re-election was indeed free and fair. He also called for sanctions against his country to be lifted. Now, a number of international election observers said the elections were marred by irregularities, but the Zimbabwean president has dismissed these claims. Let's unpack this further. We're joined this morning by political analyst Kudakwashe Manjonjo, who is in Harare, Zimbabwe, for us this morning. Kudakwashe, it's great to talk to you. Before we get to what Emmerson Mnangagwa had to say at the UN General Assembly, there were a number of diplomats who didn't even stay to listen.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me. Yes, a number of diplomats decided to have a tea break while President Mnangagwa was speaking, and I think that's important. We have to put this into context that no one is forced to sit down and listen to any head of state speak because there's so many speeches that happen. But what does happen is that when you do have influence and you do have support, you do have emissaries, diplomatic emissaries, staying behind to listen to what you're saying. It is not only a good picture diplomatically, but it's also important to actually get viewpoints if they think what you're saying is important to their own strategic interests. So the fact that there was such a low turnout for President Mnangagwa's speech is concerning for his own political legitimacy on the international scene.
So you're saying, technically speaking, not everyone is going to stay for every single speech, but that number that did stay, 37, by any stretch of the imagination is quite low.
It's extremely low. We're talking about nearly 200 countries that go to the UNGA, so if we're going to put that in percentage-wise, that's less than 25%. You're not passing matric even with that kind of turnout. So that's a very worrying thing for the turnout that President Mnangagwa has faced. And even if you see the ones who did stay are those that support him. Your China's, your Russia, in one form or the other, were still within the room. So it does say something, the fact that a lot of people that he's trying to re-engage with in terms of the re-engagement policy were not willing to stay in to listen to what he had to say.
Do you reckon that Emmerson Mnangagwa would have been fazed by this kind of turn of events?
I think fazed will be a big word. I think it'll be annoyed, but not fazed. Annoyed in the sense of he probably expected this to happen. This is not the first time this has happened. This was a very similar situation, I think, about 2 years ago at the UNGA, just after COVID, where he didn't have a good turnout. But what makes this year different is the fact that this is after an election. So because of that, he was expecting to at least see some interest in what is happening in the Zimbabwe situation. And because of that, I think he is annoyed by the fact that they failed to actually have that diplomatic impetus to get him onto the center stage, or at least become one of the key issues surrounding the UNGA conference this time.
Yeah. So Emmerson Mnangagwa on the podium there, going some way to reassure. I think reassure is maybe the wrong word. Because the more you say it, the more you say something, it doesn't make that thing true, right? But the more he says the elections were free and fair, it does appear the less people sort of believe that.
Exactly. I think if something is free and fair, you're not focusing on mentioning that, you're focusing on governing.
Right.
And the fact that instead of announcing proper policies, plans, etc., he has to constantly talk about the election being free and fair. And we have to be honest too, this is one of the few situations where President Mnangagwa does have an international stage. Most of the times, because of various forms of sanctions, he does not even get a chance to enter the USA. So for him, this is the only platform where he can actually speak directly to a number of the Western countries. So with that said, he took the opportunity to make us claim that the election was free, but the fact that he keeps regurgitating this, that's definitely worrying for him.
Yeah. He talked about the country enjoying peace before, during and after, quote, our free, fair, transparent and credible elections. Again, you're saying the same thing over and over again, and that's despite several observer missions saying that there were so many irregularities. And perhaps let's hone in what Sadik had to say.
Yeah, exactly. As has been widely reported, Sadik, led by President Chilema from Zambia, not by the president himself, but he sent his emissary, former Vice President Newzroom, they came out and really outlined how many faults were with the election, and that was unheard of from Sadik. So, again, linking back to why Mnangagwa has to keep emphasizing that the election was free and fair, he is saying this, but Sadik, the AU, the EU, and the Commonwealth have all come out saying that that was not the case, especially the point of transparency or credibility or fairness. the fact that there were voting stations that were opened late, the fact that there was some very strange counting that was done in outskirts in the rural areas, which till now the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has refused to verify by releasing accounts. They argue that they don't have to do this, but if anything, if you want to show credibility, this is something that you do. It's done worldwide, and if the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission wants to put a firm stance on the fact that this election was free and fair, as claimed by the President Mnangagwa, that had to change in terms of what the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has done since the election.
Yeah, running out of ballot papers in some constituencies, pushing the elections to even the next day because of these difficulties. I mean, it's unheard of in a free and fair election, isn't it, Kudakwashe?
It is, definitely. And I think the challenge now is that Zimbabwe has never had a great election. I think since 1980, and even then, 1980 did have violence in it. So our history as Zimbabwe in terms of elections has just been extremely disappointing. But with such a low bar already, the 2023 election even went further. We're speaking about people who voted at 4 a.m. and the results, so far analysis has come out that a lot of women voters in the urban areas did not come out to vote because of the fear of what could happen for you waiting in a line, in a queue in the middle of the night, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. It's absolutely impossible, and we're talking about living in a very patriarchal society. So because of that, that is itself forcing a certain gender to literally not vote, and that's very disappointing. And again, this only happened in urban areas where the opposition was expected to win. So because of all these irregularities, I think Mnangagwa is standing on a very shaky ground, and he's going to have to keep bursting out the statements that he has for at least another year or two. But in seeking that legitimacy on the international stage is going to get even tougher and tougher. And because of that, some structural changes that he's hoping for, diplomatic changes, such as the removal of sanctions, seem to not be coming into play. So obviously this brings into question, as you've just said, legitimacy is a major concern for Emmerson Mnangagwa, particularly on the world stage and particularly insofar as sanctions are concerned. Definitely. So you'll see the types of sanctions that Zimbabwe is on. There are two different types, broadly speaking. We have what we call targeted sanctions that go directly to personnel within a country, in this case Zimbabwe. Then there are more what I call economic sanctions, which are a lot more elaborate. The economic sanctions are the ones that are a bit more worrying. These were mainly enacted by USA with the Zidera Act in 2001. And what those sanctions do, they essentially limit the amount of financial activities that Zimbabwean banks can have with the international community. So we're speaking things like lines of credit, concessional loans, etc. So because of that, the challenge now happens is that not only does it limit the amount of room Zimbabwe has to grow economically, but it also has some tangible effects on the common person. But we have to remember that the reason USA is doing this against Zimbabwe is that they vehemently believe that this is one of the only ways that the human rights abuses that have happened since the Mugabe regime into the Mnangagwa regime can be changed or at least stopped. That has not been the case so far. But now, on the other side of President Mnangagwa, there are ways or steps that he can take to get the removal of such sanctions that he keeps saying are the cause of the elections. Are the cause of the economic malaise that Zimbabwe is currently going under. And the reality is that sanctions are not the main reason that our economic is in such a bad shape. That is definitely not the main reason. However, they do play a vital role in terms of political legitimacy and diplomatic diplomacy and diplomatic assurances that cover a lot of economic investments that come into developing countries like Zimbabwe. We are not going to be AAA graded in any way. We need to have political stability for us to attract any form of investment. I mean, in more or less ways, we're going against another 100 developing countries searching for the exact same dollar from the United States of Zimbabwe, from the United States of America. So because of that, as long as Mnangagwa cannot show that he has proper legitimacy, the sanctions will not be removed, which will make his role as being the president of the country a lot more difficult. Yeah,
and the point of it is, Kudakwashe, is that ordinary Zimbabweans are the ones, ultimately, that will bear the brunt of this.
Definitely. And that's the most terrible thing about all of these things. I think it's unfortunate that the United States were hoping that this would push out the elite in terms of using the sanctions, but that has not been the case. There are definitely tangible results from what the sanctions have done to show that the livelihoods of a lot of people are not as great as they could have been. Of course, we're putting this against the other things that cause problems in Zimbabwe: corruption, misgovernance, etc. And those things are very, very important, more important than sanctions. But whatever thing causes the livelihoods of Zimbabweans to not progress needs to be worked on. And President Mnangagwa had a great opportunity with his previous elections to have solid ground for re-engagement and maybe give us another step forward to really start progressing. And that has not happened. So now the question then becomes, what will be the next thing to happen? Are we going to keep living in this sanctions-based, corrupt country that we're currently living? Or there are going to be tangible changes, maybe through Sadik, as you noted at the UNGA. President Ramaphosa also came out complaining about sanctions against Zimbabwe. Again, we're not saying that sanctions are not detrimental to the Zimbabwe situation. They certainly are, but they're not the only thing. It would have been great if President Ramaphosa said, besides the sanctions, he called out his brothers in Zimbabwe to say that we also need to work on the corruption and the misgovernance within your own country. Wow. Then that would be more realistic rather than the message that he sent through to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we got a sense that that is how our own President Cyril Ramaphosa would react, because he was one of very few leaders on the continent even that attended the very poorly attended inauguration of Emmerson Mnangagwa.
Exactly. I think they're linked by blood, unfortunately, in this case, where Mr. Mnangagwa and Mr. Ramaphosa have decided to really support each other, even on the SADC platform, on the UN platform, and this is going to carry on. But that's detrimental to both their own political survivals. Ramaphosa is facing an election very soon, and the Zimbabwe question, especially regarding migration, is going to definitely be one of the top 3 issues that South Africans are going to be asking questions about to potential presidents. There's ESCOM, of course, that's a big crisis, the electricity crisis, but of course the migrant issue, which is heavily linked to the Zimbabwe situation, is a key electoral issue. And I do not think Ramaphosa is in any way helping his case by not having a firmer stance, not against migrants, as ANC has done so far, but against the ZANU-PF government. He has not shown any form of public standpoint where he's seen to criticizing the ZANU-PF government. And because of that, he is now putting his own political survival into a very, very unsure ground. And if anything, Zimbabwe might be the demise of Ramaphosa in the coming election if he's not careful in terms of his relations with Mr. Mnangagwa.
Are you holding any hope insofar as the Sadik process is concerned? Part of what Cyril Ramaphosa also had to say on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly was that that report is now before Sadik and it will be debated and then, decisions will be taken from there. Do you hold any hope in the ability of Sadik to step in here?
My hope is basically, again, based on Mr. Ramaphosa. We have to remember that SADC is not an institution which is on a different level. It's a state-led institution, which basically means that the countries decide what SADC will do. It's not the other way around. It's very different from the European Union, where European Union in itself can tell countries what to do. But within SADC, we need countries to have an agenda and set an agenda and then fight for this on the SADC platform. So basically, when Ramaphosa comes out to say Sadik has had a chance to look at the report and they are going to discuss, he is basically saying him and the other presidents are going to discuss what to do with the Zimbabwe situation. So he and the other presidents from, in this case, Mozambique, Angola, and Namibia, who have come out in very much strong support from Mnangagwa, are the ones who are essentially the kingmakers for the Zimbabwe situation and crisis. If they decide on the SADC platform that they are going to have a firm stance on the Zimbabwe situation, then we can see SADC having something for the country. However, for that to happen, Ramaphosa has to definitely change his diplomatic stance. And currently, that does not seem to be the case. So now the question is, where can Ramaphosa get the pressure to change his stance? And that pressure has to come from opposition parties in South Africa, but also civil society before this upcoming election. Because if that is not done, we are faced with a situation where Ramaphosa will lift up his hands to say that Sadik said something and we're going to work with Sadik. But he is Sadik. Ramaphosa and the other presidents are Sadik. And we need to constantly remind Ramaphosa that. Henceforth, the civil society pressure, the pressure from opposition parties, has to be intense and consistent over the next couple of months, so that it's to sit down on the Zimbabwe question. But again, I'll keep emphasizing this. It's all in Ramaphosa's hands.
Yeah. I mean, given what you've just said, do you reckon it is a foregone conclusion? Do you see it going any other way than what Cyril Ramaphosa has already uttered in the public sphere?
Again, it will only go another way if there's enough pressure from opposition parties in South Africa and civil society. Currently, that has not been the case, and it's very unfortunate. Because of that, what we now have is that there is not enough pressure for Ramaphosa to then use as an excuse, which I think he will have to do to at least get some form of change from ZANU-PF. He has to be able to go to Mnangagwa and say, I have supported you, but there's way too much pressure coming from within South Africa, and there's way too much pressure coming from within Zimbabwe. I think the Zimbabwean civil society and opposition have done some really good things, even putting it onto the table and said, like, that's a great diplomatic victory. However, they cannot do this themselves. So until we see some form of change within the movement and the impetus coming from South Africa, I don't think there will be anything different coming up. And henceforth, the crisis can only change if it is seen as the crisis that is Zimbabwe will only change if South Africa starts seeing this as a crisis. And we have a great opportunity because of the current political climate to put pressure on President Ramaphosa to try change his outlook on Zimbabwe, and then maybe that's how. But in my own view, until that happens, that is not going to be the case.
Kudakwashe Manjonjo, some incredible insight from you this morning. Thanks very much indeed. Zimbabwe political analyst, he joins us from Harare this morning.